I want to be as neutral as possible in the setup. Please give us your assessment of Vice President Harris' economic plan rollout on Friday.
Comrade, I look forward to the 5-year plan that will have wonderful grain export, grain production quotas, and we will finally crush the kulaks and that's terrible. It's terrible. Um, Hugh, I'm very proud of my work for the Post. I'm very proud of your work for the Post, in addition to what I do at National. But like, none of us, I don't know if anything we do for the rest of the year will be nearly as much of a crotch kick to the Kamala Harris campaign as our colleague Catherine Rampel. And the just the chef's kiss headline: "Hey, if your opponent's going to going to call you a communist, maybe don't call for price controls." It was just, in addition to being very cogent, and by the way, we should point out Catherine Rampel, as far as I know, is not a conservative, but she just knows
No.
economics and just knows that price controls are not something that work. The best thing you can say about this is like, oh, don't, kind of what Jonathan Martin tried to do over Twitter. She's not going to do this, conservatives. None of this is going to happen. This is just pandering for votes. She's going to be held in check by a Republican Senate, and probably, yeah, we're probably got the West Virginia seat, and Tester looks vulnerable in Montana, but I would not want to bet my mortgage on Republican control of the Senate. Am I crazy, Hugh?
I am very confident about picking up the Senate, actually, but I still am afraid about the Democrats' increasing resort to executive orders. Richard Nixon had authority, actually, to impose the price controls of 71 through 74. But as I said on Special Report on Friday night, Jim, I built the Nixon Library. I've run the foundation twice. We do not have an exhibit on Richard Nixon's wage and price controls. There's no reason.
It's
We do
tiny
not
in a
really
corner,
headline that.
dusty, cobwebs. Nobody wants to. Yeah, you leave it off the tour guide map. Yeah.
I want to
Like
read to
this
you.
is okay.
PBS went back and looked at the 73, 74 edition of Wage and Price Control. Quote, ranchers stopped shipping their cattle to market. Farmers drowned their chickens and consumers emptied the shelves of supermarket. Nixon took some comfort from George Shultz, who said, quote, at least we have convinced everyone else of the rightness of our original position that wage price controls are not the answer. It was like a gift.
Goes out and says, "See, I told you it wasn't going to work, but I guess we had to do it to prove to you."
But
Besides the
it
price
was,
control, yeah.
I was astonished by that. But then part two, $25,000 to every first-time home buyer. I spent 30 years as a land use lawyer. Only local governments approve housing starts, and then they only do so with federal and state compliance according to permit. There is no way the federal government can do this, and nor do we want to do this. The federal government can't build 3 million houses. They don't have the authority to do so, and we don't want to give kids 25 grand because they'll get a house they can't afford.
First of all, when you come out, the attitude was like, "Oh, Kamala Harris is calling for 3 million new houses." Earlier this year, Joe Biden only called for 2 million new houses. This is bold and exciting and dynamic and all that stuff. Hugh, I looked it up. We build anywhere from 1.4 to 1.6 million houses a year. So you're basically saying, over the next 2 to 3 years, I want you to do what you'd be doing anyway, and then I want to take credit for it for all that. That's by the way, the building houses. At least that, in theory, is attempting to expand supply. The $25,000 for every first-time home buyer, that's expanding demand, which is not what you do if you want prices to go down. By the way, the other great irony is that people who own houses don't want prices to go down. They want to get paid, the maximum. Everybody goes on Zillow and says, "Oh my God, my house is worth so much." And by the way, localities which calculate property taxes, they don't want property values to go down either. They don't want houses to become cheaper. But I
Jim,
think one of
inside
the
the
things,
Beltway where we both live, what would
no, I'm
$25,000
outside
do
you.
for someone?
I'm outside by a mile, maybe two.
Oh, by a mile. Okay, within 5 miles of either side of the Beltway, what would 25,000 do for a new home buyer?
It's a mathematical formula: jack over squat. But
Yes,
basically,
that's
yeah,
it.
very little. Yeah.
So it
Um,
might help in Nebraska. It could certainly help in Warren, Ohio, where I spent last weekend. It's a stupid idea. So how does she spend 25 days coming up with policies that failed 50 years ago?
Other than the price controls, most of what she's offering, I think the editors of of National Review have an editorial. But it's Bidenomics bigger and more expensive. The child tax credit, everything is kind of stuff we've already been doing, but we're going to do it more. And I'm also kind of curious, like again, the way you kind of know this is all just a bidding war for votes, and there's really no sense of having to pay for it, other than but they talk about tax increases that are always easier to talk about than to actually enact, coupled with the fact that there's no discussion of the degree to which we're paying interest on the debt and how that's taking up a bigger and bigger chunk of it. Like there was in 2021, whether or not we thought it was a good idea, and we did not think it was a good idea, the Biden administration could say, we're just going to borrow the money. We're just going to borrow the money. Money has no meaning anymore. And actually, to their credit, they did get us to the point where money has a lot less meaning than it used to, by devaluing it. But the idea is that, like in 2025, you cannot borrow the way you did during even the Trump years or the Obama years or the Bush years or anything like that. It is much more expensive to borrow for the federal government to borrow money.
We've never actually been in a situation. We've never been here in my adult lifetime where housing costs, as a matter of interest in loans, so little during the Trump years, 2 and 3% mortgages, and so much more during the next successive 4 years. We've never been in this situation, but of course there's going to be a housing shortage because people aren't going to give up those mortgages, Jim. I don't know anyone who says, I'll give up my 3% mortgage and go get a 6.5% mortgage. Do you?
Yeah, and everybody who, let's say you're in a look, Shea Geraghty has, according to in the eyes of Fairfax County, this house has become a lot more valuable than it was a couple of years ago. Pretty much the same house. You remember, the number of times you couldn't hear me over the kitchen work being done, but otherwise it's basically the same house. And Fairfax County is like, wow, you are a really wealthy man. Well, I'm wealthy in the sense that my house is valuable more, but it's not like that's money in my pocket. And Fairfax County gets to say, "Oh no, you can afford to pay a lot more in property taxes now because your house is so valuable." Now, let's say I decided to sell it; every other house has gone up in equal value, roughly. So, unless I'm moving from a high cost of living part of the country to a low cost of living part of the country, there's no way to get it. It doesn't really do you any good. All of this, whatever money you get,
it'll hurt you.
You have to.
It'll hurt you. So here's my last question, Jim. You have a young family, a younger family than most. You're still raising kids. Mike Rogers, running for Senate for Michigan, was on last hour, and he used a metric with which I had not been familiar for years because the fetching Mrs. Hewitt does not believe in eating at Denny's because she can produce a Denny's breakfast for about 1/10 the cost. He tells me the Grand Slam went from $5.99 under Donald Trump to $12.99 now. What is the food bill at Shea Geraghty doing in recent years?
Oh, considerably higher. And a good chunk of our shopping is done at Trader Joe's. Whenever I mention that, and I'm like, wow, grocery prices have gone up. People are like, you spend money at expensive places. Actually, not really. I looked it up, and Trader Joe's is on the lower end of prices. I wrote about this in the Post a couple of months ago, and I talked about menu prices at restaurants. We go out to eat in the Geraghty house. And I said that because of inflation, I don't know what is a just normal, this is what things cost now price versus you're getting gouged and this is a ridiculous price to pay. And I use the example of crab cakes. Now, Hugh, I don't know how often you go out. I don't know if you order crab cakes, but what would you say the typical price for a crab cake entree is at a restaurant?
$15.
Oh, it's been a while, Hugh. It's been a long while. All right. So, generally $20. Like, it used to be you could go to a nice restaurant, and if you ordered like a burger, you could get out of there for 20 some bucks once they throw in tax, tip, all that kind of stuff. Oh, by the way, District of Columbia throws in a surcharge separate from the tip for the living wage, right? So I write about this, and I'm like, no, pretty much $28 is like what you're looking at for. Yeah.
See, I ate crab cakes on Monday night, but they were prepared by my sister-in-law, so I had no idea. I don't normally order.
Are you getting the Monday? Anthony Bourdain said don't eat out on Monday nights because that's where you get all the leftovers from the stuff they couldn't sell over the weekend. But anyway, I write this, and somebody in the comments section says Geraghty's got expensive taste. He doesn't know where to shop. You can find lots of places where you can get a crab cake for $14 or less in the District of Columbia. And I had two thoughts. The first thing was, if it's for $14 or less, I don't know if I trust it. That there's something's wrong with that crab cake. It was, it's green or something. Second thing is, again, they tell us don't read the comment section. I read this and I call up.
No, don't read the comment section.
No, but I call her up and I say, Do you think you can find a good crab cake for less than $14 in the District of Columbia? Mrs. Geraghty doesn't swear. She swore.
I'm now going to call him Jim Crab Cakes Geraghty because he is his inflation barometer is crab cakes, and my inflation barometer, Jim, are eggs, a carton of eggs. I went to 6 eateries and I relied upon the fetching Mrs. Hewitt to inform me about Costco. Eggs are between $4.29 and $7 a carton in Maine. I know what the polls show. I don't believe Trump's in trouble because I think people in the end can't afford another 4 years of this. What do you think?
I think if Trump talked relentlessly about inflation, he'd be in much better shape than if he ran around criticizing Brian Kemp or talking about AI affecting crowd sizes in Kamala Harris photos, or the Congressional Medal of Honor isn't as good as the Presidential Medal of Freedom. If he stuck to that, he'd be in much better shape. I will point out, and I'm looking forward to it was just last week, Hugh, that one of those rare times a reporter could shout a question at Joe Biden. Has the U.S. beaten inflation, Mr. President? Biden responded, yes, yes, yes. I told you we're going to have a soft landing. We're going to have a soft landing. My policies are working. Start writing that way, okay? Okay, thank you. Now, that was on, I think, Wednesday. Friday, Harris goes out and gives her economic speech, and the portion that everybody enjoyed clipping, and the notion it would make this great ad for Trump. We know the prices went up during the pandemic when the supply chains shut down and failed. By the way, my apologies, I don't do a good Kamala Harris impression yet. Our supply chains have now improved. Prices are still too high. A loaf of bread costs 50% more today than it did before the pandemic. Ground beef is up almost 50%. I'm Donald Trump and I approve this message. But anyway, so I'm looking forward to, hopefully at some point during this convention, when Kamala Harris will debate Joe Biden on whether inflation is beat and whether things are affordable. And
that's brilliant. That's a good line. You should use that in the column. Jim, I got to play for you two Harris clips.
All right. People should listen to your podcast because that's how I quote myself, and they get to hear it before the newsletter hits their email boxes.
Let me ask you, did you play high school sports of any sort?
No, and I was going to shock you. I was a drama kid.
Okay, well, I'm not shocked. I played golf. That doesn't count. So every coach who's listening out there, every single one, I want you to hear what Kamala Harris told the Alquipa High School football team on the weekend. Cut number 13.
And by doing that, and all that that requires, which is the hard work, the practice, working as a team, knowing that you will be undefeated even if you don't win every game, but no...
Stop. What do you think, Jim? Has that ever been said in any locker room anywhere?
The idea you will be undefeated if you don't win every game. First of all, I do begin to understand how they assess the economy in the Biden administration now. That if losses count as wins, okay, now all of a sudden things are falling into place. If you want to say you don't have to win every game to be a winner in life, sure, that's fine. You want to say that in the end, like there are a lot of ways you could say that, and I think that's the point she's making. But
you know what? We just got done watching the Olympics. No one got on the wet medal stand who hadn't actually won. All right, Jim, let me play one more Kamala Harris word salad from Pennsylvania this weekend, cut number 14.
And that's what our election is about. Our election is about understanding the importance of this beautiful country of ours in terms of what we stand for around the globe as a democracy. As a democracy, we know there's a duality to the nature of democracy. On the one hand, incredible strength when it is intact. What it does for its people to protect and defend their rights, their liberty, and their freedom. Incredibly strong and incredibly fragile.
All right, Jim, what's that mean?
So, Hugh, did you ever see I think it was like 1999 action comedy superhero movie, Mystery Men?
No.
So,
no.
Great. Okay, the vastly underrated Wes Studi plays a character called the Sphinx, and the idea he's the mentor character to these kind of bumbling loser superheroes, and all of his wise teachings are basically inversions, right? To learn my teachings, I must first teach you to learn. He who questions training only trains himself at asking questions. What you care what is outside, it is inside. What is inside cares for you. And then finally, my favorite, when you can balance a tack hammer on your head, you will head off your foes with a balanced attack. It is all this looping, to go right, you must go left. To go up, you must go down. The opposite of whatever you're trying to do is how you try to do it.
So what was she saying in that democracy quote? The inversion stuff I get, but what does it mean?
If I don't win, democracy is over. Therefore, to preserve democracy, you don't have a choice in who you vote for.
That's exactly, I thought that's what she was saying. I just want to confirm by you. I have one more Kamala Harris quote. We get so few that I want to play them for you. She got a question. She got a question this week, and she answered it about her two policy proposals, price controls and massive subsidies for home buyers. Cut number 15.
You unveiled some economic policies last week.
Yeah.
Can you explain how you're going to pay for those? And can you give us a sense of what other policies you want to unveil going forward?
Sure.
All right, stop for a moment, just so Jim Geraghty heard that. The question is, you unveiled your policy proposals. How are you going to pay for it? Okay, started from the beginning, and now he'll be able to track it. Cut number 15.
You unveiled some economic policies last week.
Yeah.
Can you explain how you're going to pay for those? And can you give us a sense of what other policies you want to unveil going forward?
Sure. Well, you just look at it in terms of what we are talking about, for example, around children and the child tax credit and extending the EITC. It's at $6,000 for the first year of a child's life. The return on that investment in terms of what that will do and what it will pay for will be tremendous. We've seen it when we did it in the first year of our administration. We reduced child poverty by over 50%. So that's a lot of the work. And then what we're doing in terms of the tax credits, we know that there's a great return on that investment. And when we increased home ownership in America, what that means in terms of increasing the tax base, not to mention property tax base, what that does to fund schools, again, return on investment. I think it's a mistake for any person who talks about public policy to not critically evaluate how you measure the return on investment. When you are strengthening neighborhoods, strengthening communities, and in particular the economy of those communities, and investing in a broad-based economy, everybody benefits, and it pays for itself.
Okay, so, Jim, the question was, how do you pay for it? What was the answer?
The viewpoint, as far as I can tell, of Kamala Harris and apparently most of the Democratic Party is that supply side economics, the Laffer curve, every concept that tax cuts pay for themselves proposed by Republicans is absolute nonsense. It's voodoo economics, as George H.W. used to call it way back in the day. It's absolute bonkers, off the wall. But every tax cut that she proposes will pay for itself, and they don't need to worry about offsets. They don't have to worry about reduced government income, deficits, debt, any of that kind of stuff. All these things are going to pay for themselves, Hugh. Don't you worry.
So, last question. There's a reason that she doesn't engage with the media, and I think it was obvious there. Can she keep that up? Will that work?
Yeah. It shouldn't. And everybody, by the way, one of our esteemed employers, the Washington Post, did write, "Hey, if we ever got the chance to interview Kamala Harris, these are the questions we'd like to ask." I haven't seen that from the New York Times. You hear grumbling, you hear murmurs of discontent here and there, and you get those mini brief availabilities before or after an event for like a handful of questions and these like 2-sentence answers. But think about it, never mind, Harris. At least you could point back to past interviews and past press conferences she's done as vice president over the last 3.5 years. Not a lot, but they're there. Hugh, you notice Tim Walz hasn't answered a single question since he became the running mate?
I had not, but now you're right. Jim, right? It's astonishing to me.
No sit down with 60 Minutes. No, sit down on the Sunday shows. Vance is doing all the Sunday shows, And by the way, considering the coverage of Vance and considering the coverage of Walz,
we have 30 seconds.
Why should
30 seconds.
Do an interview? Why? All the media does is punish you if you're a Republican, whereas if you're a Democrat, you get. Here's the thing: in both Biden and in Harris, the Democrats have selected two people who cannot go through an interview without creating a headache for themselves.